The letter trembled in Ethan Miller's calloused hands as he stared at the woman before him. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't what he had agreed to. The advertisement had mentioned nothing about blindness, nothing about milky blue eyes that stared past him rather than at him. A cruel joke, perhaps, or a desperate deception. Either way, he couldn't accept her. He wouldn't. The ranch was dangerous enough for someone with perfect vision. For someone like her, it was a death sentence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "I'm sorry, Miss Bennett," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "There's been a mistake." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. A subtle straightening of her spine, a slight lift of her chin. Dignity in the face of rejection. It only made him feel worse. "I understand," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I should have been more forthcoming in my letters." The stagecoach that had brought her stood waiting, the driver already growing impatient. Ethan stepped back, guilt and relief warring within him, as Clara Bennett turned away, her white cane tapping a hesitant path back toward the coach. The sound of that cane against the dusty Montana earth would haunt him all the way back to his empty ranch. He had no way of knowing then that when the early autumn blizzard struck 3 days later, trapping them both in circumstances neither could have foreseen, that same woman he'd turned away would become his salvation, and that her unseeing eyes would eventually show him the way back to life. Clara Bennett had never felt cold like this. Boston winters were harsh, certainly, but this Montana blizzard cut through her wool coat as if it were made of paper. The wind, a living thing with claws and teeth. The stagecoach had overturned 2 miles outside of Pinewood Junction, thrown from the trail by a combination of ice and panicked horses. The driver's leg was broken, his screams of pain silenced now by unconsciousness. The other passenger, an elderly gentleman traveling to visit his daughter, had hit his head during the crash and hadn't stirred since. "Hello?" Clara called, her voice immediately swallowed by the howling wind. "Can anyone hear me?" She had crawled from the wreckage moments after impact, dragging herself through shattered wood and bent metal. Her hands were cut and bleeding, though the cold had numbed the pain to a distant throb. Snow accumulated on her eyelashes and melted against her skin, each flake a tiny needle of ice. Her cane was lost somewhere in the wreckage, leaving her truly unmoored in a world that had suddenly become even more hostile. 3 days. She had been in Montana territory for only 3 days, waiting at the boarding house in Pinewood Junction for the next stagecoach out. Back to Boston, back to humiliation, back to the pitying whispers that had driven her west in the first place. After Ethan Miller's rejection, she had sat in her rented room, fingers tracing the embossed pattern on her father's pocket watch, wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her life. "I can manage quite well on my own," she had told the postmistress Martha Wilson, who had kindly offered her a place to stay until transportation could be arranged. "I've been blind for 5 years now. I've adapted. But here, in the middle of a Montana blizzard with no landmarks to guide her, no familiar surroundings to navigate by touch or sound, Clara wasn't certain she could adapt quickly enough to survive. The wind changed direction, carrying with it the scent of pine and smoke. Smoke meant fire, fire meant people. She turned toward it, arms outstretched as she stumbled through knee-deep snow. Each step was a battle, the terrain beneath her boots uneven and treacherous. She counted her paces, trying to maintain a straight line toward the source of the smoke. 100 steps, 200. The cold seeped into her bones, turning her thoughts sluggish. She had read once that freezing to death was almost peaceful. In the end, like drifting off to sleep, a dangerous thought. And "I keep moving," she whispered to herself, teeth chattering so violently she bit her tongue. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. "Just keep moving." A branch whipped across her face, its frozen needles scraping her cheek raw. She had entered a forest without realizing it, the ground suddenly more sheltered from the wind, but more treacherous underfoot. Roots and fallen branches caught at her skirts, threatening to topple her with each step. She had lost track of her count, the numbers slipping away like melting snow. The smoke smell grew stronger, and with it came the faintest echo of hope. She was moving in the right direction at least, but how much farther, how much longer could she keep going? Her fingers had long since lost all feeling, and her legs moved more by momentum than conscious will. It was the dog that found her first. A deep rumbling bark cut through the storm's wail, followed by the crunch of approaching footsteps. Clara stopped, swaying slightly as exhaustion threatened to pull her down into the snow. "Hello," she called again, her voice cracking. "Please, I need help." "Miss Bennett?" The voice was familiar, deep, rough-edged with surprise and something else. Disbelief, perhaps, or regret. It took her frozen mind several seconds to place. Mr. Miller." A strong arm circled her waist, steadying her as her knees finally gave way. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" Ethan Miller demanded, his voice close to her ear. Heat radiated from his body, tantalizingly close. "Stagecoach," she managed, the words slurred by lips that no longer worked properly. "Accident. Others hurt." "Where?" he asked, his tone shifting instantly from shock to urgency. "How far back?" Clara shook her head, disoriented. I can't." "Never mind," Ethan said. "We need to get you warm first. Hold on to me." Before she could respond, he had lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he began to move with surprising speed through the forest. The dog barked once more and then led the way, its bulky form breaking trail through the snow. Clara's head lolled against Ethan's shoulder, consciousness slipping away despite her best efforts to stay alert. "Stay with me, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice sharp with command. "Talk to me. Tell me about Boston." It was the last thing she wanted to discuss, but the urgency in his tone compelled her to respond. "A cold there too," she murmured, "but different. Genteel cold, polite cold." A sound that might have been a chuckle rumbled through the chest pressed against her side. "Nothing polite about Montana winters. They'll kill you just as soon as look at you. Like the people," she whispered, immediately regretting the words. Ethan's stride faltered for just a moment. "Some of us, maybe," he conceded, and then they were moving again. The transition from storm to shelter happened so suddenly that Clara gasped. One moment they were in the swirling maelstrom of snow and wind, and the next they were enveloped in blessed stillness. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee, rich, earthy scents that spoke of safety. Ethan set her down carefully on what felt like a bench near a heat source. A fireplace, she realized, as warmth began to seep back into her frozen limbs, bringing with it waves of pain. "I need to go back for the others," Ethan said, already moving away. "My brother Thomas is in the back room. I'll call him to help you." "Wait!" Clara reached out blindly, her fingers catching the rough fabric of his coat. "The driver has a broken leg. The other passenger was unconscious when I left. I shouldn't have left them, but I couldn't help them, and I thought..." "You did what you had to do," Ethan cut her off, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Thomas, get out here!" Footsteps approached from another room, heavier than Ethan's, more deliberate. "What's all the..." The new voice stopped abruptly. "Who's this?" "Miss Bennett," Ethan said, already moving toward what must be the door. "Stagecoach accident about 2 miles out near the East Ridge. There are injured. Get her warm while I take Jupiter and go find them." "Ethan, that ridge is treacherous in this weather." "Just do it," Ethan snapped, and then he was gone, the blast of cold air from the opening door making Clara shiver violently. Thomas Miller sighed heavily, the sound of a man accustomed to his brother's stubborn nature. "Well, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice gentler than his brother's. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes before you freeze to death in front of our fire, which would be a terrible waste of good firewood." Despite everything, Clara found herself smiling weakly at the attempt at humor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I don't have anything else to wear," she said, realizing for the first time that her trunk was still with the stagecoach, if it hadn't been lost in the crash. "My sister-in-law left some things behind," Thomas said, his voice suddenly more subdued. "I'm sure Ethan wouldn't mind you borrowing something. Wait here." Clara sat very still, focusing on the returning sensation in her extremities. The pain was excruciating as circulation returned, but she welcomed it. Pain meant life. The dog that had accompanied Ethan approached, its wet nose nudging her hand before a large, heavy head settled on her knee. She stroked its fur, finding comfort in the simple, warm presence. "That's Ranger," Thomas said, returning to the room. "Don't mind him. He's a better judge of character than most people around these parts." He pressed a bundle of fabric into her hands. "Here, not the height of fashion, I imagine, but dry at least. There's a screen in the corner there. I'll turn my back while you change." Clara clutched the clothes gratefully. "Thank you. I'm blind, Mr. Miller. I might need some assistance finding this screen." There was a momentary pause, and Clara braced herself for the usual reaction: pity, discomfort, or awkward curiosity. Instead, Thomas simply said, "Ah, that explains why you're not complaining about my ugly mug." 8 steps forward, then 4 to your right. The screen's got a rough patch on the left panel about shoulder height. You can use that to orient yourself. Surprised and oddly touched by his matter-of-fact assistance, Clara followed his directions, finding the screen exactly where he had indicated. The clothes were simple: a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of lavender and soap, woolen trousers that were far too long, and thick socks that had been darned in several places. She rolled up the trouser legs and pushed the 2 long sleeves of the shirt up to her elbows, feeling like a child playing dress-up, but profoundly grateful for the dry garments. "There's coffee on the stove," Thomas called from across the room. "Strong enough to stand a spoon in, as my brother likes it." "That sounds wonderful," Clara replied, making her way carefully back toward the fire. Her stockinged feet slid slightly on the wooden floor, and she moved with caution, one hand extended to prevent any collisions. The layout of the room was beginning to form in her mind. Fireplace straight ahead, table to the left, stairs to a loft perhaps, behind her. She had always constructed such mental maps, even before losing her sight, but now they were essential to her independence. Thomas guided her to a chair at the table, pressing a steaming mug into her hands. The coffee was indeed strong, but the bitter heat was exactly what she needed. As she sipped, feeling warmth spread through her chest, she became aware of Thomas, studying her silently. "You're the mail-order bride," he said finally. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Former mail-order bride. Your brother made it quite clear that I wasn't what he had expected." Thomas snorted. "Ethan's been making poor decisions since Abigail died. Turning you away might be the worst one yet." "He didn't know I was blind," Clara said, feeling oddly compelled to defend the man who had rejected her. I wasn't entirely honest in my letters." "And he didn't bother to get to know you before sending you packing," Thomas countered. "Sounds like you're both keeping secrets." Before Clara could respond, the door burst open again, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and the sound of labored breathing. "Thomas!" Ethan's voice was strained. "Help me get him inside!" Thomas moved quickly, his chair scraping against the floor as he rose. Clara set down her coffee and stood as well, unsure how to help, but unwilling to remain idle. Heavy footsteps and grunting effort marked the arrival of what must be one of the stagecoach victims. "The driver?" she asked, moving toward the sounds. "Dead," Ethan replied bluntly. "This is Mr. Calloway. He's alive but unresponsive." "Put him in my bed," Thomas directed. "Miss Bennett, if you'll excuse us, I can help," Clara insisted. "I may not be able to see, but I'm not helpless. I trained as a nurse's aide during the war." There was a brief silence, and she could almost feel the brothers exchanging glances over her head. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice tight with what might have been surprise or reluctant respect. "Very well. Thomas, get him settled. Miss Bennett, there's a medical kit in the cupboard beneath the stairs, second shelf from the bottom." Clara nodded and moved carefully in the direction she believed the stairs to be, one hand extended before her. Her fingers encountered a wooden banister, then followed it down to the base where, as promised, she found a small door. Opening it, she counted shelves from the bottom, her fingertips eventually grazing a metal box with a handle. She lifted it out carefully and carried it back toward the sounds of the men working. "Here," she said, holding out the kit. "You said you had medical training," Ethan reminded her, taking the box from her hands. "What would you suggest for a head injury?" Clara took a deep breath, mentally reviewing what little she knew. "First, establish if he's breathing regularly and check his pulse. Then examine the wound carefully. Clean it if possible, but don't press too hard on any depression. In the skull, keep him warm and try to get fluids into him if he regains consciousness, but don't force it. Watch for signs of brain fever, confusion, agitation, uneven pupils." Another silence, this one surprised. Then Thomas said, "She knows more than the so-called doctor in town, at least." "That's not saying much," Ethan muttered, but there was less resistance in his tone. "Very well, Miss Bennett, if you're feeling up to it, you can assist." For the next hour, Clara worked alongside the Miller brothers, her fingers gentle but confident as she cleaned Mr. Calloway's head wound, while Ethan checked for other injuries, and Thomas prepared a broth in case their patient woke. The elderly gentleman had a significant gash on his temple, but no obvious fracture, and his breathing remained steady throughout their ministrations. "He has a chance, at least," Ethan said finally, stepping back from the bed. "Nothing more we can do until morning except keep the fire going and wait." "I should check on the horses," Thomas announced. "Make sure they're settled for the night." After he left, an uncomfortable silence descended. Clara stood awkwardly by the bed, suddenly acutely aware that she was alone with Ethan Miller, the man who had rejected her sight unseen, who had then saved her life, and who now seemed to be reassessing his initial judgment. "You handled yourself well," he said finally, the words sounding as if they had been dragged unwillingly from him. "Thank you for going back for them," Clara replied, choosing to focus on his actions rather than his grudging compliment. "It was brave of you in this weather." "It was necessary," he corrected, "not brave. Bravery would have been telling you the truth 3 days ago instead of turning you away like a coward." Clara tilted her head, surprised by the admission. "The truth." Ethan sighed heavily, the sound of a man unaccustomed to explaining himself. "I should never have placed that advertisement. Thomas thought, well, it doesn't matter what he thought. I'm not fit company for anyone, let alone a wife." "Because of Abigail?" Clara asked softly, then hastily added, "Your brother mentioned her name." The silence that followed was so complete that for a moment Clara wondered if Ethan had left the room. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. "Yes, because of Abigail and Emma." "Emma, my daughter. She was 4. Clara's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Miller." "Ethan," he corrected, his voice rough. "If you're going to be snowed in with us for the foreseeable future, you might as well use my given name." "Clara," she offered in return, extending a hand in what she hoped was his direction. "The trail to town will be impassable for at least a week, maybe more." "A week?" Clara repeated, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I've imposed on your hospitality far longer than I intended." Thomas's laugh was unexpected, a short, gruff sound with genuine amusement behind it. "Ma'am, nothing about your presence here was intended by any of us, but since we're stuck with each other, we might as well make the best of it." The straightforward practicality in his voice made Clara smile despite herself. "You're very kind, Mr. Miller." "Thomas," he corrected. "Only the bank manager and the sheriff call me Mr. Miller, and I don't much care for either of them." The door to what Clara assumed was a bedroom opened, and Ethan's voice broke the momentary silence. "He's sleeping again. Fever's down, though." "Good news," Thomas replied. "Our guest is up too." Ethan's footsteps approached, then stopped. Clara could feel his gaze on her, assessing. She straightened instinctively, lifting her chin. She would not be an object of pity, especially not from this man. "Miss Bennett," he acknowledged, his tone giving away nothing. "How are you feeling?" "Much improved, thank you," she replied with equal formality. "Though concerned about Mr. Calloway." "He's stable," Ethan said, moving to what sounded like the stove. The clank of a pot suggested he was serving himself coffee. "Asked about you, actually. Seemed to think you'd saved his life by going for help." Clara shook her head. "I merely stumbled in the right direction. Pure luck." "Not many would have left that wreckage at all," Ethan countered, surprising her. "Most would have stayed put, frozen to death waiting for rescue that might never have come." It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered, and Clara wasn't quite sure how to respond. She sipped her coffee instead, savoring the rich bitterness. "We need to discuss arrangements," Ethan continued after a moment, his chair scraping as he joined them at the table. "With the trail to town blocked, you'll have to stay here until it clears." "I understand," Clara said, trying to keep the apprehension from her voice. Being dependent on the hospitality of a man who had already rejected her once was humiliating at best. "You'll need proper clothes," Ethan continued. "Practical things. Thomas, would you mind if Miss Bennett borrowed some of Abigail's things? They might need taking in, but—" "I don't need charity, Mr. Miller," Clara interrupted, her pride flaring. "What I'm wearing will suffice." "It's not charity, it's common sense," Ethan replied, an edge creeping into his voice. "That fancy Eastern dress won't keep you warm or allow you to move around the ranch, and it's covered in dirt and blood besides." Clara opened her mouth to object further, but Thomas intervened. "Abigail would have wanted her things to be used, Miss Bennett. They've just been gathering dust these past 2 years. Seems a waste, especially when they're needed." Put that way, refusal seemed both ungracious and impractical. Clara nodded reluctantly. "Very well, thank you." "Good," Ethan said briskly. "Now, about your duties." "Duties?" Clara echoed, startled. "Everyone pulls their weight here," Ethan explained, his tone suggesting this should have been obvious. "Thomas and I have the ranch to run, can't afford to lose a day's work, especially with winter settling in. Mr. Calloway will need tending, and there are household tasks that need doing." For a moment, indignation flared hot in Clara's chest. She had come west as a prospective bride, not a housekeeper or nurse. But the reality of her situation quickly dampened her pride. She was stranded, dependent on these men's goodwill, and work was preferable to idleness. "What did you have in mind?" she asked carefully. "Can you cook?" Ethan asked bluntly. Clara hesitated. "Simple things, yes, though I may need some guidance in an unfamiliar kitchen." "What about nursing? You mentioned experience." "I assisted at a field hospital briefly during the war," Clara clarified. "I'm not trained, but I know basic care, changing bandages, monitoring fever, administering medicines." "Good enough," Ethan decided. You'll tend to Calloway and help with meals. Thomas will show you around the kitchen this morning. I need to check the herd, make sure none strayed during the storm. The matter-of-fact way he assigned her tasks, without asking whether she was willing or able, sparked her temper again. And if I refuse? The silence that followed had a distinct quality of surprise. Then Ethan replied, his voice cooler than before. Then you're welcome to sit in that chair until the trail clears, Miss Bennett, but you'll find the days pass mighty slow with nothing to occupy them. With that, he stood, footsteps retreating to what sounded like the door. Heavy fabric rustled, putting on a coat, she guessed. Then the door opened, bringing a blast of cold air before closing again with decisive finality. Thomas sighed. You'll have to forgive my brother, Miss Bennett. Social graces weren't his strong suit even before Abigail and Emma died. Now, he trailed off. Now he doesn't see the point, Clara finished quietly. I understand more than you might think, Mr. Miller. Thomas, when I lost my sight, many people treated me as if I'd lost my worth as well. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, how did it happen, if you don't mind my asking? Most people either avoided the question entirely or asked with morbid fascination. Thomas's straightforward curiosity was almost refreshing. Scarlet fever, 5 years ago. I was 21. The doctors said I was lucky to survive at all. Didn't feel lucky, I imagine, Thomas observed. Clara smiled faintly. No, not at first. She ran her fingers along the edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood. But we adapt, don't we? Find new ways to navigate the world. Some of us do, Thomas agreed. And she heard the implied comparison to his brother. Now, how about I show you this kitchen before Ethan returns and accuses us both of laziness? The kitchen, as it turned out, was a marvel of organization. Not by design, Clara suspected, but from years of bachelor practicality. Thomas guided her through it methodically, placing her hands on each important feature. The cast-iron stove with its various hotspots, the pump at the sink, the shelves where staples were stored in predictable positions. Ethan has a system, Thomas explained as he showed her where the dried beans were kept. Might seem peculiar, but it works. Coffee, flour, and sugar on the top shelf. Beans, rice, and dried fruit on the middle. Potatoes and onions in the bin below. Salt pork and jerky in the pantry, along with preserves. Clara committed each location to memory, creating a mental map she could navigate by touch. And where do you keep the plates and utensils? Plates in the cupboard above the sink, arranged by size. Cutlery in the drawer below. Cups on the hooks to the right, Thomas replied. It's not fancy, but it's functional. Clara nodded, appreciating the logical arrangement. Who does the cooking normally? We take turns, though neither of us would win any prizes, Thomas admitted, a smile in his voice. Mostly beans, salt pork, and biscuits, if we're feeling ambitious. Abigail was the cook. Made sourdough bread that would make you weep, venison, stew that could tempt angels down from heaven. The fondness in his voice when he spoke of his sister-in-law warmed Clara. You were close to her. She was like a sister to me, Thomas said simply. She and Emma brought life to this place. Since they've been gone, he trailed off, then cleared his throat. Well, let's just say a woman's touch has been sorely missed around here. The implication hung between them, that Clara might provide that missing element, at least temporarily. It was a strange thought, considering she hadn't been deemed suitable as Ethan's wife. Yet here she was, about to assume many of the duties that would have been hers had he not rejected her. I'll do my best, she said finally. Though I can't promise my cooking will tempt any angels, Thomas chuckled. After 2 years of Ethan's biscuits, trust me, anything would be an improvement. They spent the next hour preparing a simple breakfast for themselves and a thin broth. For Mr. Calloway, Thomas proved to be a patient teacher, explaining where Clara could find each ingredient and how to tell when the skillet was hot enough by holding her hand above it to feel the heat. Working in an unfamiliar kitchen without sight was challenging, but Clara had always been adaptable. By the time they had finished cooking, she felt reasonably confident she could manage on her own next time. Mr. Calloway was awake when Clara brought him his broth, though still confused and weak. She introduced herself, explaining the situation as simply as possible, then helped him sit up enough to sip the warm liquid. "You're the angel," he murmured between sips, "the one who went for help." "Hardly an angel," Clara replied, smiling as she held the cup to his lips. "Just fortunate enough to find aid when it was needed." "Don't remember much," Calloway admitted, his voice slurring slightly with fatigue. "Stage hit something. Terrible noise. Then nothing until I woke here. Rest now," Clara advised, easing him back against the pillows as he finished the broth. "Your body needs to heal." "My daughter," he said suddenly, agitation making his voice stronger, "in Bozeman, expecting me. She'll worry. When the trail clears, Mr. Miller will send word," Clara assured him. "Try not to fret about it now." Calloway subsided, exhaustion claiming him once more. As his breathing evened into sleep, Clara sat beside the bed for a moment longer, considering their parallel situations. Calloway's daughter would indeed be worried, just as Clara's own father must be wondering why he hadn't received word of her safe arrival and marriage. The letter she'd posted from Pinewood Junction, explaining her rejection and imminent return, would take weeks to reach Boston, by which time her father would have already spent days imagining all manner of calamities. The thought of her father, Professor James Bennett, with his perpetually ink-stained fingers and distracted smile, sent a pang of homesickness through her so acute it was almost physical. He had opposed her coming west, of course, had listed countless reasons why a blind woman shouldn't travel across the country to marry a stranger. She had been so determined to prove him wrong, to show that her blindness didn't define her capabilities or limit her future. "And look how well that turned out," she murmured to herself, smoothing the blanket over Calloway's sleeping form. The cabin door opened and closed, bringing a rush of cold air and the heavy tread of boots on wooden floorboards. Ethan had returned. Clara rose and made her way carefully back to the main room, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance. "Calloway?" Ethan asked without preamble. Awake briefly, ate some broth, concerned about his daughter in Bozeman. "Sleeping again now," Clara reported, adopting the efficient tone she'd once used when reporting to the doctors at the field hospital. "Good," Ethan said, the sound of rustling suggesting he was removing his outer garments. "Any fever?" "Slight, but not worrying. The wound seems clean," Ethan grunted acknowledgement. "Thomas?" "Gone to check the barn and feed the animals," Clara supplied, feeling oddly like a messenger between the two brothers. Silence fell, awkward and heavy. Clara stood uncertainly, unsure of her place in this household. Should she return to Calloway's bedside, withdraw to the small room she'd been given, or was she expected to engage with Ethan despite the tension between them? "You should see the cattle," Ethan said unexpectedly. "I mean..." He stopped, clearly realizing his poor choice of words. Clara bit her lip, fighting an inappropriate urge to laugh. "Perhaps you could describe them instead," she suggested, deciding to spare him the embarrassment of an apology. Ethan cleared his throat. "Right, well, they're Herefords mostly, red-bodied, with white faces. Sturdy breed, good for this climate. Got about 60 head in the home pasture, another 100 or so ranging further out." "That sounds like a substantial operation," Clara observed, genuinely impressed. "Just the two of you manage all that?" "Hire hands during calving season and roundup," Ethan explained, seeming to relax slightly now that they were discussing practical matters. "Rest of the time, we manage. The ranch isn't large by Montana standards, The Wilsons over in the next valley run 5 times our number, but it's enough. How long have you been here? Clara asked, moving to sit in one of the chairs by the fire. The heat was welcome after the persistent chill that seemed to permeate the cabin despite the fire's efforts. Ethan hesitated. Then she heard him sit in the chair opposite. 8 years. Came out after the war. Thomas followed a year later. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. Met Abigail in Pinewood Junction. She was the schoolteacher, newly arrived from Pennsylvania. Married her 6 weeks later. The simple statement contained volumes, Clara thought. 6 weeks from meeting to marriage suggested a passion and certainty that must have been overwhelming for both of them. What would it be like to be so sure of another person that quickly? Is that why you chose the mail order route this time? She asked before she could stop herself. Less emotional entanglement? She regretted the question immediately, sensing Ethan's withdrawal even before he spoke. That's not a subject I care to discuss, Miss Bennett. Of course, she said quickly. I apologize for the intrusion. The silence stretched between them again, taut with unspoken words. Clara wished fervently that she could see his face, read the expressions that might reveal what he was thinking. Then again, perhaps it was better not to know. I need to make some repairs to the north fence, Ethan said finally, rising from his chair. The snow collapsed a section. Thomas should be back soon. If Calloway wakes again, try to get more broth. Into him. I will, Clara promised, listening as he gathered his things and left once more. Alone in the main room, Clara sat for a long moment, trying to make sense of her situation. In her logical planning for this journey west, she had envisioned 2 outcomes. Either Ethan Miller would accept her as his bride despite her undisclosed blindness, or he would reject her and she would return east immediately, chastened but wiser for the experience. This limbo, rejected yet stranded with the very man who had deemed her unsuitable, had never factored into her considerations. What made it all the more confounding was Ethan himself. His blunt practicality and emotional reserve should have been off-putting, yet there was something compelling about him. In the brief moments when he forgot to maintain his distance, like when he'd started to tell her about the cattle, she glimpsed someone different, a man passionate about his land, committed to the life he'd built, capable of deep feeling despite his efforts to suppress it. You're being ridiculous, she told herself firmly, standing up and feeling her way to the kitchen. Speculation about Ethan Miller's character was pointless. In a week or 2, the trail would clear, and she would return to Pinewood Junction to await the eastbound stage. She would never see, in a manner of speaking, Ethan Miller again. Better to focus on her immediate duties than to wonder about what might have been. The kitchen was as Thomas had described, and Clara moved through it with growing confidence, exploring the shelves and bins by touch. She found a sack of beans and decided to start soaking them for supper. A simple task, but one that would contribute to the household. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, an old habit from her days teaching piano in Boston. Music had always been her refuge, the one thing blindness couldn't take from her entirely. That's pretty, Thomas said, startling her as he came in from outside. What is it? Chopin, Clara replied, flushing slightly at being caught. A nocturne I used to play. I didn't hear you come in. Snow muffles everything, Thomas observed, stomping to remove the snow from his boots. Even my size 14s. You play piano then? I did, Clara confirmed, returning to her task of measuring beans. I taught music before coming west. Huh? Thomas said thoughtfully. Funny coincidence. There's an old upright in the storage room that used to be Abigail's. No one's touched it in years. Clara's fingers stilled in the bean sack. You have a piano? Here? Ethan had it brought all the way from Denver as a birthday gift for her, Thomas explained. Cost him a small fortune in shipping. She used to play in the evenings after Emma was asleep. Beautiful thing to hear after a long day's work. The thought of a piano, silent and neglected, sent a sharp pang through Clara. She had sold her own instrument before leaving Boston, the money helping to fund her journey west. The farewell to her beloved Steinway had been almost as painful as leaving her father. She began, then stopped herself. It seemed presumptuous to ask if she could play the instrument that had belonged to Ethan's dead wife, especially given the circumstances of her presence here. Thomas seemed to understand anyway. "I think it would do the old thing good to be played again," he said casually. "Probably out of tune, but better than nothing." Clara smiled gratefully. "Perhaps, if Mr. Miller doesn't object." "I wouldn't ask him directly," Thomas advised. "Ethan's peculiar about Abigail's things, but if he happens to hear music coming from that room someday, well, easier to ask forgiveness than permission, as they say." The idea was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. To play again would be wonderful, but to risk angering Ethan and making her stay even more uncomfortable gave her pause. Still, the prospect of having music back in her life, even temporarily, was almost too enticing to resist. "I'll think about it," she promised, resuming her task with the beans. "For now, I should focus on earning my keep." Thomas chuckled. "Fair enough. Speaking of which, I should go split some more firewood before the next storm rolls in. They tend to come one after another this time of year." After he left, Clara finished preparing the beans and set them to soak. Her hands, now idle, felt restless. She thought of the piano, hidden away in some storage room, its keys silent for 2 years. The image tugged at her, an almost physical pull. Perhaps later, when the men were busy elsewhere, she might explore a bit more. Not to play, not yet, but just to find it, to touch it, to know it was there. The day passed in a rhythm of simple tasks, tending to Calloway, preparing a midday meal when the men returned briefly from their work, learning the layout of the cabin through careful exploration. By late afternoon, Clara felt reasonably confident navigating the main living areas without assistance. The cabin, she discovered, was larger than she'd initially thought. A main room with the fireplace, a kitchen area, 3 bedrooms, one, currently, occupied by Calloway, and what seemed to be a small study or office. It was while exploring this last room that she made a discovery. Her fingers, trailing along a shelf of what seemed to be ledgers and account books, encountered something different, the smooth, polished wood of a picture frame. Curious, she lifted it carefully, fingers exploring the carved edges before moving to the protected surface within. A photograph, she realized, one of those stiff, formal portraits that required subjects to hold perfectly still for uncomfortable lengths of time. "What are you doing in here?" Ethan's voice, sharp with surprise and something harsher, made her jump. The frame slipped from her grasp, hitting the desk with a clatter. "I'm sorry," Clara said quickly, heart racing. I wanted to learn the layout of the cabin and—" "This room is private," Ethan interrupted, his footsteps quick and heavy as he crossed to her. She felt him take the photograph from where it had fallen, his movements precise but tense. "These are not for your handling." The rebuke stung, all the more because she had meant no harm. "I apologize," she repeated stiffly. "I didn't realize some areas were off limits." "Well, now you do," Ethan said, his voice tight. "These are all I have left of them. I don't want them disturbed." Understanding washed over Clara, softening her indignation. Of course, photographs of Abigail and Emma, precious mementos of the family he had lost. "I truly am sorry," she said more gently. "I would never damage something so important." Ethan's breathing was audible, slightly ragged, as if he were struggling to control some strong emotion. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less intense. "You don't understand. You can't see what's lost when someone carelessly handles these memories, when the image smudges or fades because of oils from fingers that had no business touching them in the first place." The words struck deeper than he could have known, touching directly on the fear that had haunted Clara since losing her sight. That memories, like photographs, would fade without visual reinforcement, that the faces of loved ones, the details of precious moments, would blur and eventually vanish from her mind's eye. "I understand more than you think," she said softly. "I remember my mother's face only because I memorized it before the fever took my sight. I touch objects that belong to her because tactile memory is all I have left. I don't have photographs to remind me, Mr. Miller. Once a visual memory fades from my mind, it's gone forever." The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief, though neither acknowledged it aloud. Finally, Ethan sighed, the sound of a man reluctantly conceding a point. "Just ask next time, before you explore new areas," he said, the anger gone from his voice, replaced by simple weariness. "I will," Clara promised, turning to leave the room. At the doorway, she paused. "They must have been beautiful, your wife and daughter." Now, for a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. Yes, they were everything. The vulnerability in those 3 simple words stayed with Clara as she returned to the kitchen to prepare the evening meal. There was a depth of feeling in Ethan Miller that belied his gruff exterior, a capacity for love so profound that its loss had nearly destroyed him. Understanding this made his rejection of her seem less personal somehow. How could any woman, sight or no sight, compete with the ghosts that haunted this house? The thought was oddly comforting as she worked, arranging ingredients by touch and smell, gaining confidence with each successful task. By the time Thomas returned from the barn, she had a pot of bean soup simmering on the stove, its rich aroma filling the cabin. "Smells promising," Thomas observed, hanging his coat by the door. "Ethan back yet?" "In his study," Clara replied, careful not to mention the incident with the photograph. "Soup will be ready in about half an hour." "Good timing," Thomas said, moving to wash his hands at the sink. "I'm starved, and Ethan's sure to be in a mood if we've been working different sides of the property all day." Clara tilted her head. "Does that happen often? Him being in a mood, only on days ending in I?" Thomas replied, the joke gentle rather than mocking. "He takes too much on himself. Always has, even before. Now it's worse, like he's punishing himself by working from dawn till dusk." "Punishing himself for what?" Clara asked, stirring the soup thoughtfully. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "For surviving, I suppose. Abigail and Emma caught influenza 2 winters back. Ethan was away, delivering cattle to Fort Benton. By the time he returned, they were already buried." His voice grew softer. "He's never forgiven himself for not being here, though there was nothing he could have done. Medicine wasn't enough. Doc Parker tried everything." The tragedy, stark in its simplicity, made Clara's chest ache. How terrible for him, for both of you. "It was," Thomas agreed simply, "is still, some days more than others." A heavy tread from the hallway announced Ethan's approach, cutting their conversation short. Clara focused on the soup, adding a pinch of salt and stirring it carefully. Behind her, she heard the scrape of chairs as the men seated themselves at the table. "Fence is patched," Ethan reported, his voice neutral. "Should hold until spring if we don't get too much more snow." "South pasture looks good," Thomas replied. "No strays that I could find. That new bull is settling in well with the herd." The mundane exchange continued as Clara ladled soup into bowls and carried them carefully to the table, using the edge of the furniture to guide her. She placed one before each man, then returned for her own and a basket of hardtack biscuits she'd found in the pantry. "Oh, I checked on Calloway before coming in," Thomas added as Clara took her seat. "Fever's up again, but not dangerously so. Managed to drink some water when I helped him sit up." Ethan made a non-committal sound, then tasted the soup. There was a moment of silence that stretched Clara's nerves thin as she waited for his verdict. "This is good," he said finally, surprise evident in his tone. Better than we usually manage. Coming from Ethan, it was high praise indeed. Clara smiled, pleased despite herself. Thank you. It's a simple recipe my father's housekeeper taught me. The secret is a bit of bacon fat, rendered with the onions, before adding the beans. Your father has a housekeeper? Thomas asked, curiosity evident in his voice. What does he do, if you don't mind my asking? He's a professor of classical literature at Harvard, Clara explained, breaking a biscuit into her soup. Terribly impractical, perpetually distracted, and completely lost without Mrs. Harrington to manage the household. And he let you come, all the way out here alone? Ethan asked, an edge of disapproval in his voice. Clara's smile faded. I'm 26, Mr. Miller. My father doesn't let me do anything. I make my own decisions. Even foolish ones? The challenge was unmistakable. Clara set down her spoon, facing him squarely across the table. Especially those. How else would I learn? She paused, then added more softly, he did try to dissuade me. Said I was being reckless, chasing a fantasy of independence that would likely end in disappointment or disaster. Smart man, Ethan muttered. Perhaps, Clara conceded, but he also taught me that a life without risks is hardly worth living. Fortune favors the bold, he always says, quoting his beloved Romans. Thomas chuckled. Fortune's been a mite stingy with her favors. In your case recently, seems to me. Clara couldn't help but laugh at that, the tension around the table easing slightly. True enough, though I'm alive and relatively unharmed, which is more than might have been expected after that stagecoach accident. Why did you do it? Ethan asked suddenly. The abrupt question confused Clara until he clarified. Why did you agree to marry a stranger sight unseen? A woman with your background. Educated, from a good family, you could have had your pick of suitable men in Boston. The directness of the question surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Ethan Miller was not a man who approached anything indirectly. Still, the answer was complicated, layered with truths she wasn't sure she wanted to share with someone who had already judged and rejected her. I wanted a fresh start, she said finally, settling on the simplest version of the truth. Somewhere my blindness wasn't the first and only thing people knew about me. In Boston, I'm poor Miss Bennett, such a tragedy about her eyes before I'm anything else. And you thought a remote ranch in Montana Territory would be easier? Ethan's skepticism was palpable. Clara smiled wryly. I thought it would be different. At least, that perhaps a man who chose a wife through letters might value other qualities above perfect vision. The subtle rebuke landed in silence. Then Thomas, clearly attempting to ease the sudden tension, said, Well, you certainly picked about the most different place from Boston you could find. That was part of the appeal, Clara admitted. I've never been afraid of challenges, Mr. Miller. Quite the contrary. I found that overcoming them is the surest way to discover one's true capabilities. There's a difference between challenges and foolhardiness, Ethan countered, though his tone was more thoughtful than condemning. Now, and where exactly is that line drawn? Clara asked. Is it foolhardy for a blind woman to teach piano, to live independently, to travel west, to marry, or perhaps merely to hope for a life beyond the narrow confines others would impose upon her? Her words hung in the air, the emotion behind them more revealing than she had intended. Clara took a steadying breath, regretting the momentary loss of composure. Forgive me. That was unwarranted. No, Ethan said after a moment, surprising her. It was a fair question, one I don't have a ready answer for. It was the most conciliatory thing he'd said to her, and Clara nodded in acknowledgement, unsure how to respond. The conversation shifted to safer topics then. The weather, the condition of the cattle, Thomas's plans for expanding the chicken coop come spring. Ordinary concerns of ranch life that gradually eased them back into less fraught territory. As Clara cleared the dishes after the meal, she reflected on the curious dynamic developing between herself and Ethan Miller. There was an undeniable tension, certainly, resentment on her part for his rejection, discomfort on his for the awkward situation they found themselves in. But beneath that, something else stirred. A reluctant respect, perhaps. An acknowledgement, however grudging, that they were both more complex than their initial assessment of each other had allowed. Whether that could ever grow into something more remained to be seen. For now, Clara was content to have reached a sort of truce, and to have produced a meal that even Ethan Miller had to admit was good. Small victories, her father would say, often preceded the larger ones. And in this remote cabin, snowed in with a man who had once rejected her, Clara would take whatever victories she could find. Days at Evergreen Ranch settled into a rhythm as predictable as the winter sun's arc across the sky. Clara woke each morning before dawn, stoking the fire and preparing breakfast before the men headed out to their work. She tended to Mr. Calloway, whose recovery progressed slowly but steadily, changed linens, mended clothes, and prepared meals with increasing confidence in the once unfamiliar kitchen. Each task mastered was a quiet victory, each day completed without major mishap, a testament to her growing competence. A week into her unexpected stay, Clara stood at the kitchen window, hands submerged in warm, soapy water as she washed the breakfast dishes. She couldn't see the landscape beyond the glass, of course, but she could feel the weak winter sunlight on her face, hear the distinctive crunch of snow beneath boots as Ethan and Thomas moved about the yard, and smell the crisp, clean scent of pine that the wind carried from the surrounding forest. It was a different sort of awareness than she'd known in Boston, rawer, more elemental, but no less rich for its unfamiliarity. "Miss Bennett?" Mr. Calloway's voice, stronger now than it had been days ago, called from his room. "Might I trouble you for some water?" Clara dried her hands quickly on her apron, one of Abigail's, hemmed to suit her shorter stature, and made her way to the bedroom that had become Calloway's temporary sanctuary. 7 steps down the hall, turn right, 9 more steps to his door. The household geography was firmly imprinted in her mind now, allowing her to move with confidence. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," she greeted, entering the room. "You sound more like yourself today." "Feel more like myself too," he agreed, the bed creaking as he shifted to sit up. "Head's finally clear. Feels like I've been swimming through molasses these past days." Clara smiled, pouring water from the pitcher on the bedside table into a cup. "Fever will do that. Here you are." She held out the cup, waiting until his fingers closed around it before releasing her grip. "Dr. Parker should be able to make it out from town soon, once the trail clears a bit more. Then perhaps we can see about getting you to your daughter in Bozeman." "You've been very kind, Miss Bennett," Calloway said after drinking deeply. "I hear you were meant to be Mrs. Miller, though. Seems there's been a change of plans." Clara's smile faltered slightly. Small communities thrived on gossip, and it seemed Pinewood Junction was no exception. Thomas must have mentioned something during his brief conversations with their patient. "Plans have a way of changing unexpectedly," she said diplomatically, "particularly out here." Calloway hummed non-committally. "Shame, though. Miller could use a good woman in his life. Been walking around like half a man since he lost his wife and little girl." The observation, delivered with the blunt honesty of the elderly, made Clara uncomfortable. She busied herself straightening the blankets at the foot of the bed. "Mr. Miller's personal affairs are his own business, I'm sure." "Course they are," Calloway agreed easily. "Just an old man's observation. Been watching people a long time, Miss Bennett. Can tell when someone's punishing themselves for something that wasn't their fault." Clara paused, curiosity overcoming her reluctance. "You knew his wife?" Abigail? Sure did. Taught my granddaughter before she passed. Sweet woman, always had a kind word for everyone. Pretty as a picture, too. Golden hair, blue eyes. Little Emma was the spitting image. Calloway's voice grew wistful. Terrible thing, losing them both at once. Miller was delivering cattle up north when the sickness took them. By the time word reached him and he made it back, they were already in the ground. It was the same story Thomas had shared, but hearing it from an outsider somehow made the tragedy more real. Clara could almost picture it. Ethan returning home expecting to be greeted by his wife and daughter, only to find fresh graves and an empty house. The image made her heart ache. Thomas said there was nothing that could have been done. She said quietly. Nothing at all, Calloway confirmed. That influenza was vicious, took half a dozen others in town too. But Miller's never been one to accept what can't be changed. Stubborn as they come, that man. A quality Clara had observed herself over the past week. Ethan approached every task, every challenge, with the same dogged determination, whether it was mending a fence in a blizzard or coaxing a reluctant heifer to feed. It was admirable, if sometimes infuriating. "Rest now, Mr. Calloway," she said, gently redirecting the conversation. "I'll bring you some broth at midday." Leaving Calloway to his rest, Clara returned to the kitchen, her mind lingering on what he'd said about Ethan, a man punishing himself for something that wasn't his fault. It explained much about his demeanor, the relentless work, the emotional withdrawal, perhaps even his initial rejection of her. A man who believed he had failed. To protect his family, might well consider himself unworthy of a second chance at happiness. The realization brought a strange mixture of emotions. Sympathy for his pain, frustration at his self-imposed isolation, and something more complicated that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Whatever her feelings, they were irrelevant. In another week, perhaps two, the trail to town would be clear enough for travel, and she would be gone from Evergreen Ranch for good. The thought brought less relief than she might have expected. Clara finished the dishes and moved on to the bread dough she had left rising near the stove. Baking bread had been a challenge at first. So much of it relied on visual cues that books and recipes took for granted. But Thomas had shown her how to test the dough with her fingers, how to listen for the hollow sound of a properly baked loaf when tapped, how to smell when it was nearly done. Her first attempts had been dense and slightly burnt, but this morning's batch promised to be better. As she kneaded the dough, her thoughts drifted to the piano Thomas had mentioned. Curiosity about the instrument had grown daily, a persistent itch she hadn't quite found the courage to scratch. Where exactly was this storage room? Was the piano truly as fine as Thomas suggested? And most importantly, how would Ethan react if he found her playing it? The last question gave her the most pause. Their interactions had evolved from openly hostile to cautiously civil over the past week, each making concessions to the awkward situation they found themselves in. Clara had no desire to upset that delicate balance by intruding on what might be another painful reminder of Abigail. And yet, her fingers ached for the familiar feel of ivory keys. Music had been her constant companion, her solace and joy since childhood. The absence of it these past months had left a void that housework and conversation couldn't fill, no matter how busy she kept herself. Only one way to find out, she murmured to herself, making a decision. Once the bread was shaped and set for its final rise, she would explore. Thomas had mentioned the storage room was off the back of the house, a space she hadn't yet investigated. An hour later, with the bread safely in the oven and Calloway dozing after a light meal, Clara set out on her quest. The men wouldn't return from their morning chores for at least another hour, giving her time to find the piano without an audience. She made her way through the kitchen to the back door, then paused, trying to remember Thomas's casual directions from days ago. Off the porch, turn left, Small door to what used to be a summer kitchen, she recalled, stepping carefully onto the back porch. The air was bracingly cold after the warmth of the house, but the sun provided some comfort as she navigated the 3 steps down to the yard, one hand firmly gripping the railing. The packed snow crunched beneath her boots as she turned left, hand outstretched to find the expected wall. Her fingers met rough-hewn logs, and she followed them until she encountered the frame of a door. It took some effort to open. The wood had swelled with moisture, and the hinges protested with a shriek that made her wince. But it gave way eventually, revealing a space that smelled of dust, old paper, and the distinctive mustiness of a room long unopened. Clara stepped inside, closing the door behind her to keep the cold at bay. The room was warmer than outside, but still chilly, its air undisturbed for what must have been months, if not years. She moved forward cautiously, hands extended to avoid collision with unknown obstacles. Almost immediately, her fingers encountered something large and draped in fabric, a sheet covering furniture, she guessed. She followed its contours, recognizing the distinctive shape beneath. "There you are," she whispered, a smile spreading across her face as her hands confirmed what she'd hoped to find. A piano, substantial and solid beneath the protective covering. With careful movements, she pulled the sheet away, folding it neatly and setting it aside before turning her full attention to the instrument. Her fingers glided over the polished wood, tracing the ornate carvings on the music rack, the smooth curve of the fallboard, the delicate inlay along the keyboard cover. It was indeed a fine piano, smaller than a full concert grand, but larger than a spinet, probably an upright grand from the dimensions. Opening the keyboard cover revealed ivory keys that felt cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. Clara pressed one key tentatively, wincing at the sour note that resulted, definitely out of tune, as Thomas had warned, but not irredeemably so. Another key, then another, mapping the damage that 2 years of neglect had wrought. Some notes were merely slightly flat or sharp, others painfully discordant. Still, the action of the keys was good, responsive under her touch, with no sticking or excessive play. The piano had been well made and well maintained before its abandonment. She sat on the bench, its wooden surface cold even through her skirts, and placed her hands in position for a simple C major scale. The resulting sequence of notes was jarring to her sensitive ears, but beneath the mistuning, she could sense the instrument's inherent quality. It would take a professional tuner to restore it properly, but perhaps she could at least improve it enough for simple melodies. Clara lost track of time as she worked, her fingers moving methodically from key to key, testing and adjusting by ear, her concentration complete. She had assisted the piano tuner, who serviced her father's Steinway often enough to understand the basic principles, though she lacked the proper tools. It was painstaking work, but deeply satisfying as the notes gradually moved closer to their true pitches. So absorbed was she in the task that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until the door opened, sending a blast of cold air into the room. She froze, fingers still resting on the keys, heart suddenly pounding. So Thomas wasn't exaggerating. Ethan's voice broke the silence, neither angry nor pleased, merely contemplative. "You actually do play." Clara turned toward the sound, hands falling to her lap. "I do, yes. Thomas mentioned the piano, and I hope you don't mind that I found it." Ethan didn't answer immediately. She heard him move further into the room, his footsteps stopping a few paces from the piano. "It hasn't been played since Abigail died. Probably sounds terrible. It needs tuning," Clara agreed carefully. "But the mechanism is sound. It was a fine instrument." "Was," Ethan repeated, a world of loss in that single syllable. Then, with a brusqueness that suggested discomfort, "You should come inside. It's too cold out here and I can smell the bread burning." "The bread!" Clara stood quickly, dismayed. "I lost track of time completely." Happens to the best of us, Ethan said, and there was something almost like humor in his voice. Come on, before Thomas eats it all, burnt or not. He's ravenous after breaking ice all morning. Clara hesitated, her hands reluctant to leave the keyboard. There was something unfinished about the encounter, something important hovering just beyond reach. Mr. Miller, Ethan, would it truly bother you if I played? I wouldn't want to intrude on your memories. The silence that followed was heavy with consideration. Finally, Ethan sighed. Memories will intrude whether I want them to or not, Miss Bennett. The piano sitting here silent doesn't change that. Another pause, then more firmly. Play if you wish. It's of no consequence to me. It was hardly an enthusiastic endorsement, but Clara recognized the concession for what it was, a small crack in the armor Ethan wore so rigidly. Thank you, she said simply. They walked back to the house together, separated by a careful distance, but somehow less at odds than they had been. The bread was indeed overdone, its crust a darker brown than ideal, but not catastrophically burnt. Thomas declared it character building, and ate 3 slices without complaint, his appetite apparently unaffected by minor culinary imperfections. That evening, after the dishes were cleaned and put away, Clara found herself standing indecisively. In the main room, Ethan sat at the table, account books open before him as he tallied figures by the light of the oil lamp. Thomas had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of physically demanding work. Mr. Calloway was sleeping soundly, his recovery progressing well enough that he required less frequent checking. Clara had finished her usual chores and now faced the prospect of empty hours before bedtime. Her thoughts returned to the piano, sitting cold and neglected in the storage room. The practical difficulties were obvious. The room was unheated, the piano badly out of tune, the hour growing late. Yet her fingers itched with the desire to play, to fill the silence with something other than the scratch of Ethan's pencil and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Was there something you needed, Miss Bennett? Ethan asked without looking up from his bookkeeping, evidently aware of her hovering presence. Clara squared her shoulders. I was wondering if I might borrow a lantern and perhaps a blanket. That made him look up. Planning a midnight expedition. Just to the piano, she admitted. I thought I might work on tuning it a bit more, unless you'd prefer I wait until tomorrow. Ethan was quiet for a moment, the only sound the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. Then she heard him close the ledger book. It's too cold in that room after dark. The temperature drops quickly once the sun is down. Oh. Clara tried to hide her disappointment. Of course. I'll wait until tomorrow then. However, Ethan continued, his chair scraping as he stood. There's no reason the piano has to stay out there. Clara's heart skipped. What do you mean? I mean, Ethan said, his voice taking on that practical tone he used when discussing ranch matters. That Thomas and I could move it into the house. There's space enough in the main room, by the east wall. His footsteps crossed the floor toward the hallway. Thomas, get your boots on, we're moving the piano. Now? Thomas's sleep-fogged voice responded from his bedroom. It's nearly 9 o'clock, Ethan. Now, Ethan confirmed, already pulling on his coat by the sound of rustling fabric. Before I change my mind. Clara stood stunned as the brothers' preparations shifted into a discussion of logistics, the best path to take, whether to remove the legs or keep them attached, how to protect the soundboard from the cold during the brief outdoor transit. It was such an unexpected gesture that she hardly knew how to respond. Thank you, she said finally, when Ethan passed close enough to hear her whispered words. This is very kind of you. His footsteps paused. It's practical, he corrected in that same matter-of-fact tone. The piano does no good sitting out there unused, and it'll be one less thing to move back to town when the trail clears. The clarification stung slightly. a reminder that her presence at Evergreen Ranch was temporary, the result of circumstance rather than choice. Still, the fact that Ethan was willing to bring a painful reminder of his dead wife into the house for Clara's benefit suggested a thawing that went beyond mere practicality. "Even so," she persisted, "thank you." Ethan made a non-committal sound and continued toward the door, where Thomas was now waiting. The two men departed with a blast of cold air, their voices fading as they crossed the yard to the storage room. Clara remained where she was, listening to the distant sounds of their efforts, muffled thuds, the occasional grunt of effort. Thomas's voice raised in what might have been either instruction or complaint. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the back door opened again, bringing with it labored breathing and heavy footsteps. "Mind your end, Thomas," Ethan directed, his voice strained with effort. "Ease it down gently." "Gently," I said. "This thing weighs more than a full-grown steer." "I'm being gentle," Thomas protested, "but my fingers are half frozen, and this blasted thing keeps trying to roll on the casters." Clara moved back, pressing herself against the far wall to give them space, as they maneuvered the piano into the main room. The sounds of their effort, shuffling feet, creaking floorboards, muttered directions, painted a vivid picture of the task's difficulty. Finally, with a collective sigh of relief, they set the instrument down. "There," Thomas declared, breathing heavily. "Reckon that's its new home unless you change your mind again, brother." "It'll do," Ethan agreed. His footsteps approached Clara. "It's against the east wall, about 3 paces from the fireplace. Should warm up overnight." Clara nodded, trying to contain her excitement. "I'll wait until morning to play, of course. It's much too late now, and you both must be exhausted." "Thoughtful of you," Thomas remarked, the smile evident in his voice, even as he yawned widely. "Though I sleep like the dead once I'm down. Wouldn't hear Gabriel's trumpet, let alone a piano." "Nevertheless," Clara insisted, "it can wait until tomorrow." But after the brothers had retired and the house settled into nighttime silence, Clara found herself drawn irresistibly to the piano. She rose from her bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the chill, and made her way silently to the main room. The fire had died down to embers, providing minimal light and heat, but she needed neither to find what she sought. 7 steps from her bedroom door to the main room, turn right. 12 steps diagonally across to where the piano now stood. Her hands found it unerringly, the polished wood already warmer than it had been in the storage room. She traced its contours reverently before sitting at the bench, her fingers finding their home position on the keys with the ease of long practice. She began with scales, playing softly, testing the instrument's response in its new environment. The tuning was still far from perfect, but the warmth of the house had already improved it slightly. More importantly, the action felt alive under her touch, responsive in a way that awakened memories of countless hours spent at her father's Steinway. Scales became arpeggios, became simple exercises, became, almost without conscious transition, the opening measures of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Her fingers moved with muscle memory, finding the notes despite the unfamiliar keyboard, adjusting instinctively for the instrument's imperfections. The piece was melancholy, yet hopeful, its gentle melody rising and falling like a human voice. Clara played with her eyes closed, as she always did now, her whole being focused on the music flowing from her fingertips. In that moment, her blindness was irrelevant. She had never needed sight to feel music, to understand its architecture and emotion. The darkness behind her eyelids was filled with sound, with texture and color and meaning that transcended visual experience. When the final notes of the nocturne faded into silence, she remained still, hands resting lightly on the keys, reluctant to break the spell that had momentarily transported her from the confines of Evergreen Ranch to a realm where limitations fell away and only expression remained. "That was beautiful." Ethan's voice, unexpectedly close, made her start. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't realized she had an audience. Heat rushed to her cheeks as she turned toward the sound. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to wake you. I thought if I played softly—" "You didn't wake me," Ethan interrupted. "I was already up." The floorboards creaked as he moved closer, stopping a few paces from the piano. Clara sensed his hesitation, as if he were approaching something volatile or fragile. "Abigail used to play that piece," he said after a moment, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. It was one of her favorites. Clara's hands left the keyboard, folding in her lap. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "How could you?" The question held no accusation, only a weariness that tugged at Clara's heart. It was strange, hearing it again after so long, like a ghost had walked through the room. "I won't play it again," Clara promised. "There are plenty of other pieces." "No," Ethan said firmly. "That's not what I meant. It was strange, but not unwelcome." Another creak of floorboards as he shifted his weight. She would have liked knowing the piano was being played again. Music was important to her. She used to say a house without music was just walls and a roof, not a home. The sentiment resonated deeply with Clara, who had always felt the same. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. The simple statement contained volumes: love, loss, admiration, and grief, all distilled into 2 words. Then, with an obvious effort to lighten the moment, she would have laughed herself silly watching Thomas and me wrestling that piano across the yard, though. Clara smiled at the image. "I imagine it was quite a sight. Like 2 bears trying to dance with a table between them," Ethan confirmed, a hint of rueful humor warming his voice. "Thomas nearly went face first into a snowdrift when his boot caught on a root." The mental picture was so absurd that Clara couldn't help laughing, the sound escaping before she could suppress it. To her surprise, Ethan chuckled too, a rusty sound, as if long disused but genuine. The moment of shared amusement settled into a comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the dying embers in the fireplace. It was the first time they had been alone together without tension or awkwardness, and Clara found herself reluctant to end the unexpected communion. "Would you play something else?" Ethan asked finally, his voice hesitant, as if he weren't sure of his right to make the request. Clara's hands returned to the keys, hovering uncertainly. "Any particular preference?" "Something hopeful," Ethan suggested after a moment's thought. "If such a thing exists in music." Clara nodded, considering. Then, with deliberate movements, she began Beethoven's Für Elise, its familiar melody lilting and sweet despite the piano's imperfect tuning. She played with gentle restraint, letting the notes breathe between phrases, infusing the well-known piece with a wistfulness that spoke to their shared moment of unexpected connection. As she played, she sensed, rather than heard, Ethan move to sit in one of the armchairs near the fire. The knowledge of his presence, his attention, should have made her nervous. She hadn't performed for anyone since losing her sight, but instead it felt natural, as if the music were a conversation between them that required no words. When the piece concluded, the silence that followed felt companionable rather than empty. Clara waited, hands resting lightly on the keys, wondering if Ethan would request another piece or if the brief interlude had reached its natural conclusion. "You play beautifully," he said finally. "Your students in Boston were fortunate." "Thank you," Clara replied, touched by the simple compliment. "Though I suspect my father's housekeeper might disagree. She used to claim I'd practiced the same passage 50 times in a row until she was ready to stuff the piano with cotton wool." "Dedication," Ethan observed, "or stubbornness?" "Both, perhaps," Clara admitted with a small smile. "My father always says I have a tendency to fixate on problems until they yield to my satisfaction." "A useful quality out here," Ethan said thoughtfully. "The land doesn't give up its bounty easily. It demands persistence." "Is that why you stay?" Clara asked, curiosity overcoming her usual caution. Despite the hardships, the isolation? Ethan was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice held a contemplative quality she hadn't heard before. Partly, there's a clarity to life here. The challenges are straightforward. Weather, predators, the land itself. You know exactly what you're fighting and why. He paused, then added more softly, it's the human complications that are harder to navigate. The admission, oblique as it was, felt significant, a rare glimpse behind the stoic facade Ethan maintained so rigidly. Clara sensed that pushing further would only make him retreat, so instead she turned back to the piano and began a gentle rendition of Brahms's Lullaby, its soothing melody filling the space between them with something warmer than words. She played for perhaps another quarter hour, drifting from one piece to another as the mood guided her. Ethan remained silent, his presence a still point in the darkness around her. Whether he was listening intently or lost in his own thoughts, she couldn't tell, but it hardly mattered. The music spoke what neither of them could articulate, of loss and longing, of unexpected connections, of the possibility that healing might come in forms not anticipated or sought. When at last her fingers stilled, fatigue finally overtaking inspiration, the cabin felt different somehow, as if the notes still lingered in the air, softening the rough-hewn logs and weathered furniture with their gentle vibrations. We should both get some rest, Ethan said, his voice low in deference to the hour. Morning comes early regardless of nighttime concerts. Clara nodded, rising from the piano bench with reluctance. Thank you for listening, and for having the piano moved. It means more than I can express. You already did, Ethan replied simply. Through the music, his footsteps approached, stopping beside her. Would you like me to light your way back to your room? No need, Clara assured him, oddly touched by the offer. I know the way by heart now. Of course you do, Ethan acknowledged, and she heard what might have been respect in his tone. Good night then, Miss Bennett. Clara, she corrected gently, after sharing music in the middle of the night, I think we can dispense with formalities. Ethan's breathing changed subtly, a small intake of breath as if surprised by her directness. Then with a warmth that hadn't been there before, Good night, Clara. Good night, Ethan, she replied, surprised by how natural his name felt on her lips, as if they had known each other far longer than their brief, complicated acquaintance warranted. As she made her way back to her room, Clara couldn't help reflecting on the strange turn her journey had taken. She had come west seeking a husband, a partner who would value her despite or perhaps even because of her differences. Rejection had seemed like the end of that dream, a confirmation of her father's pessimistic warnings. Yet somehow, in the aftermath of disaster, something unexpected was taking root. A tentative understanding, fragile but real. Whether it would grow into anything more substantial remained to be seen. The trail to town would clear eventually, and decisions would have to be made. But for tonight, with music still echoing in her mind and the memory of Ethan's quiet attention warming her heart, Clara allowed herself to hope that perhaps her father had been wrong. Perhaps fortune did indeed favor the bold, just not always, in the ways one anticipated. With that comforting thought, she slipped into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin against the night's chill. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling around the eaves with a sound like distant flutes, accompanying the deeper tones of the forest's nocturnal symphony. Clara smiled at the fanciful comparison, her pianist's mind finding music even in the wilderness sounds. As sleep claimed her, she wondered if Ethan heard it too, the subtle harmonies of the land he had chosen, the complex melody of a life balanced between struggle and beauty. Perhaps tomorrow she would ask him. Perhaps, at last, they might truly begin to talk. Morning arrived with a change in the air. Not just the subtle warming that hinted at winter's eventual surrender, but something less tangible, a shift in the atmosphere of Evergreen Ranch itself. Clara felt it as she moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast, a lightness that hadn't been present before. The piano stood in its new place against the east wall, its presence altering the room in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Ethan and Thomas spoke more over breakfast, their conversation flowing more naturally than the stilted exchanges of previous meals. Even Mr. Calloway seemed affected by the change, his voice stronger as he called greetings from his sickbed when Clara brought him tea and porridge. "You're looking mighty pleased with yourself this morning, Miss Bennett," he observed, shrewd eyes studying her face. "Something good happen?" Clara smiled, adjusting his pillows so he could sit more comfortably. "The piano has been moved into the house. I was able to play a little last night." "Ah," Calloway nodded knowingly. "Music does wonders for a troubled spirit. Abigail used to play hymns on Sundays. Folks would come from miles around just to hear her. Not many pianos in these parts." "So I gather," Clara replied, setting his breakfast tray across his lap. "It needs tuning badly, but even so, it felt wonderful to play again." Calloway took a sip of tea, then asked casually, "And how did our stoic rancher take to having his wife's piano disturbed after all this time?" Clara hesitated, uncertain. How much to share about the nighttime encounter that felt somehow private, almost intimate in its unexpectedness. "He seemed to appreciate the music," she said finally. "It was his idea to move the piano inside, actually." Calloway's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Well, now that is interesting." He studied her with renewed interest. "Perhaps there's hope for Ethan Miller yet." Before Clara could respond to this cryptic remark, the sound of hoofbeats and voices from the yard interrupted their conversation. Boots stomped on the front porch, followed by a loud knock at the door. Clara excused herself and hurried to answer it, curious about this unexpected visitor. They rarely had callers, especially with the trail to town still partially blocked by snow. She opened the door, feeling the rush of cold air against her face. "Hello?" "Miss Bennett," a male voice inquired, surprised. "Is that really you?" Clara tilted her head, trying to place the familiar voice. "Sheriff Hayes?" "The very same," he confirmed, sounding both relieved and confused. "May I come in? It's colder than a well-digger's ankles out here." Clara stepped back, opening the door wider. "Of course. Forgive me, I wasn't expecting visitors." Heavy footsteps entered, accompanied by the rustling of a heavy coat being removed. "Neither was I expecting to find you here, Miss Bennett. Word in town was that you'd been rejected by Miller and were heading back east. Then the stage never arrived in Helena, and folks started to worry." "There was an accident," Clara explained, leading the sheriff toward the fire. "The stagecoach overturned in the blizzard. Mr. Calloway and I survived, but the driver wasn't so fortunate. Mr. Miller found me wandering in the storm and brought me here." "Lord Almighty," Hayes breathed, genuine concern in his voice. "That's a miracle if I ever heard one. And Calloway's here too, Edward Calloway, heading to Bozeman. Yes, he's recovering in the back room. His head injury was severe, but he's improving daily." The front door opened again, bringing Ethan's familiar tread and the scent of cold air and horse. "Sheriff," he acknowledged. "Thomas said you rode in. What brings you all the way out here?" Hayes cleared his throat. "Worries about the missing. Stage, for one, but also news you should hear." His voice took on a more serious tone. "The Blackfoot gang hit the Wilson place 3 nights ago, rustled 20 head of cattle, and shot Jim Wilson when he tried to stop them." A tense silence followed this announcement. Clara felt the atmosphere in the room change instantly, the earlier lightness evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Jim dead?" Ethan asked, his voice tightly controlled. "No, but it was close. Doc Parker dug the bullet out, says he might keep the arm if infection doesn't set in." Hayes' voice was grim. Martha and the boys are managing, but they're scared. The gang took most of their winter stock. Clara heard Ethan move to the fireplace, the floorboards creaking under his deliberate steps. "They're getting bolder," he said, his voice hardened to the edge she remembered from their first meeting. "Moving south into settled areas now." "That's not all," Hayes continued reluctantly. "Word is they're looking for new territory since the army pushed them out of the northern valleys. Richard Blackfoot himself was seen in Pinewood Junction 2 days ago, asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Thomas asked, having apparently joined them unnoticed during the conversation. Hayes hesitated. "About Evergreen Ranch. How many men work it, the size of the herd, whether Miller was still alone or if he'd gotten himself a wife." At this last detail, his voice shifted awkwardly. Of course, that was before anyone knew Miss Bennett was here. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. Ethan's silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before he finally spoke. "They won't find easy pickings here," he said flatly, "but we'll need to keep watch. Thomas, we should move the herd closer to the house, at least the breeding stock." "Already on it," Thomas replied. "Started yesterday after I noticed those strange tracks by the North Creek." "Tracks?" Hayes asked sharply. "You didn't mention those when I rode up." "Wasn't sure what they were," Thomas explained. "Could have been legitimate travelers taking shelter in the line shack, but now, we'd know better," Ethan finished grimly. "Sheriff, how many men can you spare to patrol this area?" Hayes sighed heavily. "That's the other problem. I've got 2 deputies, both inexperienced. The county's too big, and with winter making the trails difficult, we can't cover everywhere at once. So we're on our own," Ethan concluded, not sounding particularly surprised. "Wouldn't be the first time." "I've sent for help from the territorial marshal," Hayes offered, "but it could be weeks before anyone arrives, especially with the passes still partially blocked." Clara listened to this exchange with growing apprehension. She had read about cattle rustlers in dime novels, of course, but the reality, armed men who thought nothing of shooting a rancher defending his livelihood, was far more frightening than any fictional account. "What about Mr. Calloway and Miss Bennett?" Hayes asked, voicing the concern that had begun to form in Clara's mind. "The stage route should be clear enough for travel in another few days. It might be safer for them in town." "No," Ethan said immediately, his tone brooking no argument. "The town's the first place Blackfoot will look if he's planning something. They're safer here where we can protect them." Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions at Ethan's decisive response. Gratitude for his concern, anxiety about the danger, and something warmer that she wasn't quite ready to examine. "I appreciate your concern for our safety, Mr. Miller," she said carefully. "But perhaps Sheriff Hayes is right. We shouldn't put you and Thomas at additional risk." "It's not open for discussion," Ethan replied, his voice gentler than his words. "Calloway's still too weak for travel, and I won't send you alone into town, knowing Blackfoot and his men are watching the trails." Hayes cleared his throat. "Miller's probably right, Miss Bennett. Much as I'd prefer to have you both under my direct protection, the journey itself might be the most dangerous part right now. Better to stay put until we know more about Blackfoot's intentions." The decision thus made for her, Clara nodded her acquiescence. "What can I do to help prepare, then?" Her question was met with momentary silence, as if the men were surprised by her practical approach. Then Thomas spoke, approval evident in his tone. "Well, for starters, we might want to take inventory of our ammunition and supplies. If we're potentially facing a siege, we should know exactly what we have." "I can do that," Clara offered immediately. "If you show me where everything is kept, I can count and organize while you attend to the cattle." "Good idea," Ethan agreed, and the scrape of a chair suggested he'd sat down at the table. "We should also establish signals in case any of us spots trouble. Sheriff, how long can you stay?" "Need to head back by midday," Hayes replied. Got other ranches to warn, and I want to check on the Wilsons again. But I'll try to ride out every few days, keep you informed of any news." The conversation turned to practical matters of defense, which approaches to the ranch were most vulnerable, how to secure the barn and corrals, whether the line shack should be abandoned or maintained as lookout posts. Clara listened carefully, mentally mapping the geography they described and committing important details to memory. If danger was coming, she was determined not to be helpless, regardless of her blindness. When Hayes departed an hour later, the atmosphere at Evergreen Ranch had transformed once again. The easy camaraderie of breakfast was replaced by purposeful activity. Ethan and Thomas moved with an efficiency that spoke of previous experience. With threats, their assignments to each other terse and precise. Clara found herself guided to the storage pantry off the kitchen, where supplies were methodically inventoried and reorganized for easy access. 6 sacks of flour, she counted, her fingers identifying each by its distinctive texture. 4 of sugar, 8 of coffee beans, dried beans enough for perhaps 3 weeks at current consumption, salt pork for about the same, preserved fruits and vegetables in good supply. Thomas made appreciative noises as he noted her findings. "Better than I expected. Ethan always did believe in stocking up before winter. What about medical supplies?" Clara moved to the shelf where bandages, tinctures, and medicines were kept. Adequate for minor injuries, but if someone is seriously wounded, she let the implication hang. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Thomas said soberly. "But perhaps you could prepare some additional bandages just in case. There's old linen in the chest in Abigail's sewing room." The casual reference to yet another of Abigail's spaces, previously unmentioned, reminded Clara how deeply the dead woman's presence still permeated the ranch. Every room, every object seemed to hold some memory of her. The piano, the kitchen organization, even the clothes Clara now wore, altered to fit her smaller frame. Yet increasingly, Clara felt less like an intruder and more like a caretaker of these memories, preserving them while finding her own place alongside them. She spent the afternoon preparing, cutting clean strips of linen for bandages and organizing them in easily accessible bundles. Mr. Calloway, informed of the situation by Ethan, insisted on contributing what medical knowledge he possessed from his years as a field surgeon during the war, information far more extensive and practical than Clara had anticipated. "Pressure and clean bandages are your first defense," he instructed as Clara sat beside his bed, listening intently. "If the bleeding won't stop, you may need to cauterize. Hot knife blade, quick and direct to the wound. Hurts like the devil, but saves lives." Clara nodded, committing the grim knowledge to memory and praying she would never need to use it. "What about infection?" "Whiskey to clean the wound, then honey if you have it. The sugar prevents putrefaction." Calloway's voice took on the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in crisis. "If fever sets in despite your best efforts, willow bark tea can help reduce it. There's wild willow growing by the creek south of the house. I noticed it from the stagecoach before the accident." As the day progressed, the preparations took on an almost surreal quality. One moment Clara was folding bandages and discussing the treatment of gunshot wounds. The next, she was baking extra bread and preparing meals that could be quickly reheated if necessary. The contradiction between these domestic tasks and their potentially dire purpose was not lost on her. Evening brought Ethan and Thomas back to the house, their boots heavy with mud and voices low with fatigue as they discussed the day's work. They had moved the most valuable cattle closer to the ranch buildings, positioned extra ammunition in strategic locations, and established a watch rotation that would begin that night. "You'll take first watch," Ethan instructed his brother as they ate the stew Clara had prepared. "I'll relieve you at midnight. We'll alternate 4-hour shifts until daybreak." "What about me?" Clara asked, setting down her spoon. "I should take a shift as well." The silence that followed her offer was telling. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "That's not necessary, Clara. Thomas and I can manage." Clara felt a flare of frustration. "I understand your concern, but I'm not helpless. My hearing is exceptionally acute, better than most sighted people's. I would notice any unusual sounds immediately." "She has a point, Ethan," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Remember when she heard that fox in the hen house before either of us? We'd have lost half the chickens if she hadn't alerted us." Ethan didn't respond immediately, and Clara could almost feel him weighing the practical advantages against his protective instincts. Finally, he sighed. "Very well, you can take the pre-dawn shift 4 to 6. That's when we're most vulnerable, with both of us having been on watch through the night. But you stay inside by the front window. Any unusual sound, any at all, you wake me immediately." "Understood." "Perfectly," Clara agreed, satisfied with this compromise. "I won't let you down." "It's not a question of letting anyone down," Ethan replied, his voice gentler than she expected. "It's about keeping you safe. You're my responsibility while you're here." The simple declaration warmed Clara unexpectedly. There was something both archaic and touching about his sense of duty, even if it sometimes manifested as overprotectiveness. "As you are mine," she countered softly. "We all look after each other. That's how it works, isn't it?" Thomas coughed, the sound suspiciously like a suppressed chuckle. "She's got you there, brother. Miss Bennett's officially part of the ranch defense now, whether you like it or not." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Clara remained, aware of a subtle change in Ethan's demeanor toward her, a new consideration that went beyond mere politeness or practicality. By acknowledging her abilities rather than focusing on her limitations, she had crossed some invisible boundary in his assessment of her. That night, after the dishes were cleared and additional preparations made for the potentially troubled days ahead, Clara found herself once again drawn to the piano. The house creaked and settled, its timbers contracting in the cold night air. Outside, the wind rustled through pine needles with a sound like distant whispers. Occasionally, an animal moved in the underbrush, small creatures going about their nocturnal business, unaware of human concerns. Time passed in this heightened state of awareness, minutes stretching into an hour, then 2. Clara remained vigilant, sorting each sound into categories of familiar and unfamiliar, safe and potentially threatening. Nothing alarmed her until, just as the first hints of dawn lightened the air outside the window, she caught the distant but distinctive sound of approaching hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several, moving at a walk rather than a gallop. Deliberate, rather than hurried, coming from the east along the main trail to the ranch house. Clara rose silently from her chair, heart pounding as she considered the possibilities. It could be neighbors coming early to offer assistance after hearing of the threat. It could be Sheriff Hayes returning as promised, or it could be the very danger they had been preparing for. She moved quickly to Ethan's study, where he had shown her the location of the bell used to signal between house and barn. 3 rings meant danger approaching. Her hand found the rope and she pulled firmly, the bell's clear tone piercing the pre-dawn silence with its warning. Almost immediately, she heard movement from the barn, Ethan responding to the signal. Thomas's door opened, his footsteps hurried as he entered the main room. "What is it?" he asked, voice instantly alert despite his interrupted sleep. "Riders approaching from the east," Clara reported, returning to the window. "Multiple horses, walking, not running. They're trying to be quiet, but they're still at least half a mile out." Thomas joined her at the window, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "I don't see anything yet," he murmured, the tension in his voice betraying his concern. "But if they're coming from that direction, they'll be silhouetted against the rising sun soon enough." The back door opened, bringing Ethan's distinctive tread and the scent of hay and horses. "How many?" he asked without preamble, moving to join them at the window. "Can't tell yet," Clara replied, but at least 3, possibly more. Good ears, Ethan acknowledged, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in what might have been approval or simple reassurance. Thomas, get Calloway ready to move to the root cellar if necessary. Clara, there's a trapdoor under the rug by the fireplace. It leads to the same cellar. If I tell you to go, you head there immediately. No arguments. Clara wanted to protest, but recognized the sense in his instructions. Her presence in a gunfight would be a liability, not an asset. Understood, she agreed reluctantly, but don't be too quick to hide me away. I can still be useful. By staying alive, Ethan said, firmly, the sound of metal against leather suggesting he was checking his gun. That's all I ask right now. The minutes that followed stretched with excruciating slowness, measured by the approaching hoofbeats and the gradual increase in birdsong as dawn crept across the landscape. Clara remained by the window, every sense attuned to the gathering threat. She heard Thomas helping Calloway to a more secure location, their muffled conversation punctuated by the older man's protests that he could still shoot straight enough to hit the broad side of a barn. Ethan moved about the room with quiet efficiency, positioning himself strategically near the window where he could see the approaching riders without being immediately visible to them. The familiar sounds of a gun being checked and loaded made Clara's stomach tighten with anxiety, the reality of their situation suddenly, viscerally clear. "Can you see them yet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Ethan confirmed grimly. 4 riders coming slow. Don't recognize any of them, which isn't a good sign. Most of our neighbors would make sure they were clearly visible. Approaching at this hour, Clara nodded, understanding the implication. Friendly visitors would announce themselves, especially knowing the current tensions. These men were attempting stealth, which suggested their intentions were far from benign. "What will you do?" she asked, fingers gripping the windowsill tightly. "Wait," Ethan replied, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "Let them show. Their hand first. If they're just passing through, they'll stay on the main trail. If they turn toward the house..." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. The riders were close enough now that even Clara could hear the creak of saddle leather, the soft nickering of horses communicating with each other. She held her breath, waiting for the moment when their path would become clear. Continue past or turn toward Evergreen Ranch. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped entirely. The silence that followed was more menacing than any declaration of hostile intent could have been. Then a voice called out, its tone falsely friendly. "Hello, the house. Anyone awake in there?" Ethan's hand touched Clara's arm briefly. "Move away from the window," he instructed quietly. "Go to the fireplace and be ready." Clara nodded and followed his directions, counting steps carefully to the designated spot. Behind her, she heard Ethan open the window a few inches, enough to call back to the visitors without exposing himself unnecessarily. "State your business," he shouted, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man on his own property, prepared to defend it. "Now, is that any way to greet travelers, Miller?" The answering voice replied, dropping all pretense of friendliness. "We've come a long way to pay you a visit. Least you could do is offer us coffee." "Richard Blackfoot," Thomas muttered from nearby, having returned from settling Calloway. "I'd know that snake's voice anywhere." Clara's heart raced faster, adrenaline flooding her system as the name registered. This was the man the sheriff had warned them about, the rustler who had already shot one rancher and was looking to expand his territory. "You're not welcome here, Blackfoot," Ethan called back, his voice hard as iron. "Move on while you still can." A laugh, cold and humorless, drifted toward the house. "That's not very neighborly, especially when I've heard you've got guests. A blind lady, was it? Now what kind of host keeps visitors all to himself?" The direct reference to Clara sent ice through her veins. They knew about her, had specifically come looking for her, perhaps. But why? "Last warning," Ethan replied, and even Clara could hear the deadly promise in his voice. "Ride out now, or you won't be riding out at all." Another laugh followed, by the sound of weapons being drawn. "I don't think so, Miller. See, we've got you outnumbered. And I've got plans for this valley, plans that don't include stubborn ranchers who don't know when to cooperate." The tension in the air was palpable, a wire drawn so tight it could snap at any moment. Clara stood frozen by the fireplace, every muscle tense as she anticipated the violence about to erupt. This was the precipice, the moment when everything would change, for better or worse. Then, incredibly, another voice joined the confrontation, a voice that Clara recognized immediately, though she had never expected to hear it in this context. "That's quite enough, Richard," Sheriff Hayes called, his tone commanding. "You and your boys are surrounded. My deputies are positioned in the trees to your left and right, and I've got a clear shot at your back. Drop your weapons, now." The standoff outside Evergreen Ranch hung suspended in the cold morning air. Clara held her breath, fingers pressed against the rough wooden floorboards beside the fireplace trapdoor. The sudden arrival of Sheriff Hayes had changed everything, tilting the balance of power away from Blackfoot and his men. "You're bluffing, Hayes," Blackfoot called, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "You don't have the manpower to surround anyone." "Got reinforcements yesterday," Hayes replied calmly. "Marshall sent 5 men from Helena. You want to test how good their aim is?" Clara heard the rustle of movement, horses shifting nervously, men whispering urgently to each other. Then Blackfoot's voice, lower now but still audible. "This isn't finished, Miller, not by a long shot." "It's finished for today," Ethan responded, his tone unyielding. "Drop your weapons like the sheriff said." The metallic clatter of guns hitting frozen ground confirmed that Blackfoot's men had chosen to surrender rather than risk a firefight they couldn't win. Clara exhaled shakily, the tension that had held her rigid beginning to dissolve. Thomas moved to her side, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. "It's all right," he murmured. "Sheriff's got them. They're being disarmed now." Clara nodded, grateful for the update she couldn't see for herself. "What will happen to them?" "Hayes will likely escort them to the county jail," Thomas replied. "Though whether they'll stay there is another question entirely. Law's still catching up to these parts." Outside, the sound of men being ordered to dismount and horses being led away suggested the immediate crisis had passed. The front door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and Sheriff Hayes's voice now inside the house. "That was closer than I'd like," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Caught wind of their plan late last night and rode straight through. Would have been here sooner, but had to gather enough men to make the bluff work." "Bluff?" Ethan asked, sharply. Hayes chuckled, though there was little humor in the sound. "You think I actually had deputies hidden in the trees? It was just me and 2 ranch hands from the Wilson place who volunteered, but Blackfoot doesn't know that." Clara rose from her position by the fireplace, moving toward the voices. "Sheriff Hayes, you took a terrible risk." "Calculated risk." Ma'am," Hayes corrected. "Blackfoot's bold but not stupid. Facing uncertain odds, he'll retreat and regroup. Buys us time to get real reinforcements in place." The logical strategy impressed Clara, revealing a shrewdness in the sheriff she hadn't fully appreciated before. "What happens now?" she asked. "We take Blackfoot and his men to town," Hayes explained. "My volunteers are watching them while I update you. But I need to escort them to the jail personally." "And after that?" Ethan pressed, skepticism evident in his voice. "You know as well as I do, they won't stay locked up for long. Without witnesses to an actual crime on my property, the most you can hold them for is trespassing." Hayes sighed heavily. "I know. That's why I came to propose a more permanent solution. The Marshal is establishing a regional office in Pinewood Junction, more manpower, regular patrols, but it will take time to set up. Until then, you're vulnerable out here alone." "We're managing," Ethan replied stiffly. "You're isolated and outnumbered," Hayes countered. "Wilson's already been shot, and he had his sons helping him. You've got Thomas and yourself, plus 2 people who need protection." Clara felt a flash of indignation at being categorized as helpless, but before she could object, Calloway's voice joined the conversation from the doorway of his room. "Seems to me," the older man observed, his tone thoughtful, "that isolation is only a weakness if you let it be. Communities look after their own, always have." "Exactly my point," Hayes agreed, "which is why I'm suggesting you all come to town until this situation is resolved. There's safety in numbers." The silence that followed was weighted with consideration. Clara could almost feel Ethan's resistance to the idea, the instinctive rejection of abandoning his land, even temporarily. She understood it, having seen how deeply rooted he was in Evergreen Ranch, how intrinsically his identity was tied to this place he had built. "I won't run," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "This is my home. I won't be driven from it by threats." Hayes started to argue, but Clara stepped forward, a different solution forming in her mind. "What if the community came here instead?" she suggested. "Rather than abandoning Evergreen Ranch, what if we made it a gathering point, a place where neighbors could support each other?" Thomas made an appreciative sound. "Not a bad idea. The Wilsons could bring their remaining cattle here, pool resources for protection. A community defense," Hayes mused, considering. "It could work, at least temporarily. Safety in numbers without abandoning any single property completely." "It would mean more mouths to feed," Ethan cautioned, though Clara noted he hadn't rejected the idea outright. More people in close quarters. People who would contribute labor, supplies, and guns, Hayes pointed out. The Wilsons, the Petersons, maybe the Thompsons from the South Valley. All of them are at risk isolated, on their own spreads. Clara sensed Ethan's resistance softening. "It would only be until spring," she added gently, "when the Marshal's men are established and the passes are fully clear." The room fell silent again as Ethan considered. Clara wished desperately that she could see his face, read the thoughts crossing his features. Instead, she listened to his breathing, the slight shuffle of his feet as he weighed the proposal against his fierce independence. "All right," he conceded finally, "but I set the terms. This is still my ranch." "Of course," Hayes agreed quickly, relief evident in his voice. "I'll speak with the families today, see who's willing to join the arrangement. Now I need to get Blackfoot and his men secured before they figure out how outnumbered we actually are." With that, the sheriff departed, leaving a changed atmosphere in the house. The immediate danger had passed, but lasting security would require adaptation, compromise, and community, concepts that seemed at odds with Ethan's solitary nature. Clara moved to the kitchen, needing physical activity to process the morning's events. "I'll make breakfast," she announced. "Everyone must be hungry after all that excitement." Thomas followed, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. "I'll help. Seems we'll need to expand our food preparations if we're to have guests soon." They worked in companionable silence for several minutes, Clara mixing biscuit dough while Thomas stoked the stove to proper heat. It was Ethan's voice that finally broke the quiet, coming from the doorway where he had apparently been watching them. "You were right," he said simply. Clara paused, flour dusting her hands. "About what?" "About not being helpless," Ethan elaborated. "You heard those riders before anyone else could. You sounded the alarm, and now you've proposed a solution that makes sense." The admission clearly wasn't easy for him. Clara smiled softly, recognizing the significance of his words. "We all have different strengths. It's only when we recognize them in each other that they become truly useful." Thomas coughed discreetly and mumbled something about checking on the horses, excusing himself from what had become a private moment. After the back door closed behind him, Ethan moved further into the kitchen. "If other families come," he said, hesitantly, "things will change here." Clara nodded, returning to her biscuits. "Change isn't always bad." "No," Ethan agreed, coming closer until he stood beside her at the table. "It isn't." The simple acknowledgement contained layers of meaning Clara couldn't fully unravel. She continued working the dough, aware of his presence beside her, the subtle scent of leather and pine that seemed to accompany him everywhere. "When the danger is past," he continued, his voice lower now, "and the trail to town is fully clear, what will you do?" The question caught her by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Their entire arrangement had been premised on its temporary nature. She would stay only until safe passage to town was possible, at which point she would return east as originally planned. Yet somewhere along the way, that certainty had become less fixed in her mind. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "A few weeks ago, I would have said I'd return to Boston without hesitation. Now, Ethan prompted when she didn't continue. Clara turned toward him, her flour-covered hands stilling on the table. "Now I find myself reluctant to leave, which is strange, considering how our acquaintance began." A huff of breath that might have been a suppressed laugh escaped him. "Not the most promising start," he agreed. "I was harsh, unfair." "You were afraid," Clara corrected gently. "Not of me, but of what I represented. Change, vulnerability, the possibility of loss." Ethan was silent for so long that Clara wondered if she had overstepped, presumed too much about his feelings. Then, with quiet intensity, "You see more clearly than most people with perfect vision." "I listen," she replied simply. "When one sense diminishes, others compensate. I've learned to hear what isn't being said." "And what do you hear now?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara considered carefully before answering. "I hear a man who has been alone too long, who built walls for protection but found himself imprisoned by them instead, who might be ready finally to consider another way of living." Ethan's breath caught audibly. When he spoke again, his voice held a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. "I told myself I was protecting you when I sent you away, that a blind woman couldn't survive here, that I would be responsible when you inevitably came to harm." He paused, then added with quiet wonder, "I never considered that you might be exactly what this place needs. What I need." The admission hung in the air between them, monumental in its simplicity. Clara felt her heart quicken, hope rising unbidden. "And what is that exactly?" "Someone who sees beyond the surface," he replied, "who hears the music beneath, the noise, who isn't afraid of darkness, either outside or within." Clara extended her hand, palm up, an invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Ethan placed his hand in hers, his calloused fingers curling gently around her smaller ones. "I won't pretend it would be easy," he continued. "This life is hard under the best circumstances. The work never ends. The dangers are real and comforts are few. You'd be giving up much if you stayed. And gaining much," Clara countered. "Purpose, community, a life where my blindness is incidental to who I am, not definitive." She squeezed his hand gently. "But I won't make such a decision based on fear or gratitude or momentary emotion. Nor should you." Ethan's thumb traced a gentle pattern across her knuckles. "What are you proposing?" "Time," Clara answered simply. "These coming weeks while we shelter together, work together, face challenges together, let them be our test. Let's discover if what we're feeling now can withstand the reality of daily life." "A trial period," Ethan mused, a hint of amusement warming his voice. "Very practical, Miss Bennett." "I thought you might appreciate that approach, Mr. Miller," she replied, smiling despite the seriousness of the moment. "After all, practicality seems to be a quality we both value." Among others, he agreed, his hand still holding hers across the flour-dusted table. Very well, time it is. The weeks that followed transformed Evergreen Ranch in ways Clara could never have imagined when she first arrived. The Wilsons came first, bringing their remaining cattle and 3 strapping sons, who immediately reinforced the ranch's defenses. The Petersons followed with their daughters, one of whom played fiddle beautifully and joined Clara in evening musical performances that lifted everyone's spirits. The Thompsons brought chickens, preserves, and Mr. Thompson's considerable skill. As a blacksmith, what had been an isolated homestead became a temporary settlement, with tents and lean-tos expanding the ranch's capacity when the house itself could hold no more. Work was shared, meals were communal, and watches were maintained around the clock. When Blackfoot and his men were inevitably released from the county jail, they found not vulnerable, scattered ranches, but a united community prepared for their return. Clara found herself at the center of this transformation, her organizational skills and calm temperament making her a natural coordinator of the domestic arrangements. She moved through the expanded household with growing confidence, her mental map expanding to encompass new structures and faces. Children who had initially been warned to watch out for the blind lady soon competed for the privilege of sitting beside her during meals or lessons, fascinated by how she identified them. By voice or footstep, how she moved with such certainty through a world she couldn't see. Most surprisingly, she found herself teaching again, not piano this time, but reading and mathematics to the younger children whose education had been interrupted by the winter and the current crisis. The impromptu school in Ethan's study became a daily fixture, with even some of the adults attending when work allowed. Through it all, her relationship with Ethan evolved with the careful deliberation they had agreed upon. They worked side by side during the day, sharing responsibilities and learning each other's strengths. In the evenings, when the community gathered for meals and music, they often found themselves seated together, their conversations growing deeper and more personal as trust developed between them. 1 month into this new arrangement, Clara stood on the front porch, enjoying a rare moment of solitude in the midst of the busy settlement. The air had changed, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching spring. Wet earth, new growth, and a warmth that promised winter's grip was finally loosening. Footsteps approached, familiar now after weeks of listening. Ethan, his gait, unhurried as he joined her on the porch. "Beautiful day," he observed, stopping beside her at the railing. "It feels like it," Clara agreed, turning her face toward the strengthening sun. "The children say the snow is melting fast in the lower meadows." "It is," Ethan confirmed. "The trail to town is almost completely clear now. Sheriff Hayes rode through this morning while you were teaching. The marshal's men are fully established in Pinewood Junction. Patrols have begun throughout the region." The implications were clear. The temporary community they had formed would soon disperse, each family returning to their own land as the danger diminished, and spring planting demanded attention. And Clara would need to make her decision. "The stage to Helena resumes regular service next week," Ethan continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Hayes mentioned it specifically, knowing you might be interested." Clara nodded, her hands tightening on the porch railing. "Our trial period is coming to an end, it seems." "It is," Ethan agreed quietly. "Have you decided?" Clara turned toward him, wishing as she rarely did anymore that she could see his face in this crucial moment. Instead, she listened to his breathing, sensed the tension in his body as he waited for her answer. "I have," she said simply. "If you'll still have me, I'd like to stay. Not as a guest or a temporary arrangement, but as your wife, if that offer still stands." She heard the sharp intake of his breath, felt the shift as he moved closer. His hands, gentle despite their strength, framed her face with exquisite care. "It does," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "It does, Clara." When he kissed her, it felt like the culmination of a journey neither of them had planned, but both had needed. From rejection to rescue, from reluctant hospitality to genuine welcome, from cautious respect to something far deeper and more enduring. The piano music that filled Evergreen Ranch that evening was joyful, celebratory, as Clara played for a community that had become her own. Beside her on the bench sat Ethan, turning pages she couldn't see for a skill she no longer needed, his presence steady and sure as they faced their shared future together. In the darkness that had once frightened him more than her, they had found their way to light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.